Hey, I am your part-time buddy. In the next 24 hours, will the American Army enter the war? That's the question lighting up timelines right now, because it hits the human brain like a siren. It feels urgent, it feels binary, it feels like you're supposed to know. Here's what I can actually give you. Something useful, not sensational. In this video, you're getting 3 signals that usually show up before a real US ground entry. 3 realistic paths for what entering the war even means, and the one mistake people make in moments like this that turns them into free distribution for someone else's narrative. And I'm going to give you the mini payoff immediately. When the US is about to put boots on the ground, the public hype is usually late. The logistics are early. That's the whole game. So if your feed is yelling 24 hours, don't let that sentence push you into panic. Instead, ask the only question that matters. What would have to be true for a ground entry to be realistic, necessary, and politically survivable? Because entering the war is not one switch. It's a ladder. And most people confuse a rung with the top. Let's start by defining what people mean when they say, American Army will enter the war, because half the confusion is vocabulary. Some people mean U.S. forces will conduct strikes. That's not the Army entering. That's air and naval power doing what they do. Some people mean special operations raids. That's a different category. Highly targeted, limited duration, not a conventional invasion. Some people mean advisors, logistics, or intelligence support becoming more visible or expanded. That can happen without the public realizing it. And some people mean a large-scale ground campaign. Tens of thousands of troops, sustained presence, occupation-like timelines. That is the version that triggers everyone's deepest fears. Those are not the same. They do not happen on the same timeline. And they do not require the same political conditions. So if you want to be informed instead of emotionally hijacked, you need a framework that separates 3 things. What is being claimed, what is operationally plausible, and what is politically likely. Because a thing can be operationally possible and still politically impossible. And politics is not a side note. Politics is a weapon system. Now here's the first hard truth. Large U.S. ground entry is not a surprise in the way the internet imagines surprise. You can surprise with timing. You can surprise with location. You can surprise with the first move. But you cannot quietly hide the scale and preparation required for a major ground campaign. You can't vibe your way into it in 24 hours. That's why the 24 hours framing is such a tell. It's a content tactic. It creates urgency, and urgency creates clicks. But urgency is not evidence. So, here are the 3 signals you should watch if you actually want to gauge the probability of U.S. ground entry on a near-term timeline. Signal number 1, unmistakable logistics posture. Not speeches, not clips, not anonymous sources say posts. Logistics. When ground forces are about to be used at scale, you see the physical stuff move in a way that's hard to disguise and harder to reverse. Large movements of equipment, sustained airlift, prepositioned armor, medical staging, fuel staging, maintenance hubs, ammunition stockpiles, the kind of movement that looks boring until you realize it means someone is planning for endurance. Because ground war isn't just fighting, it's feeding, fueling, repairing, evacuating, and sustaining. And if you don't see the sustainment, you shouldn't believe the headline. Signal number 2, clear political authorization and narrative alignment. This is the part people hate because it feels soft, but it decides everything. Major ground entry requires a public story that can survive the first week of casualties, the first mistake, the first viral tragedy, the first diplomatic backlash, and the first domestic backlash. That story can be constructed quickly in a crisis, but it can't be invented out of nothing if the public mood and political incentives aren't aligned. So when people say, it's happening in 24 hours, ask yourself, are you seeing the kind of messaging discipline that precedes a major shift? Not emotional rhetoric, discipline. Because when the U.S. is preparing for something big, messaging tightens, language gets consistent. The frame becomes repetitive on purpose. Officials start using similar phrasing. The public is prepared gradually, even if people don't notice it in the moment. If the messaging is chaotic, contradictory, and improvisational, the odds of an immediate large ground entry are lower, because large operations don't like chaotic political environments. Signal number 3, an immediate operational necessity that cannot be solved by other means. This is the one that separates possible from likely. The U.S. has many tools before it chooses big ground entry: intelligence, cyber, air power, naval power, partner support, sanctions, diplomatic pressure, covert action. So for ground entry to be justified quickly, you usually need a problem that those tools can't solve fast enough. In plain English, something that requires physical control of territory, physical rescue, physical protection, or physical seizure. If the objective can be achieved without large ground forces, the incentive to use large ground forces drops, because ground forces are not just expensive in dollars. They're expensive in politics, in lives, and in long-term entanglement. Now let's pause for 1 second because you've already gotten the framework. Quick question for you. When you hear "enter the war," which version did your brain picture? A limited action, like a short mission, or a full ground campaign? Comment it. Just one word, limited or full, because the internet uses the same phrase to describe completely different realities, and that's how people get panicked. Now let's talk about the 3 realistic paths for the next 24 hours without pretending we know the future. Path 1. No ground entry, just escalation in other domains. This is the most common outcome when 24-hour headlines trend. What you see instead is increased posture, more defensive deployments, more aerial activity, more naval positioning, more surveillance, more warnings, more diplomatic pressure, more partner coordination. The U.S. can enter in the sense of increased involvement without crossing into a large ground campaign, and the internet will still call it entering because the internet doesn't respect categories. Path 2. A limited ground action that gets mislabeled as the Army entered the war. This is where special operations or a short-duration mission happens: rescue, raid, recovery, protection of a specific site, and the headline machine upgrades it into boots on the ground, full war. This is extremely common in modern news cycles. A small action gets described in big language because big language travels further. If this happens, you'll notice it by the details. The scope is narrow, the duration is short, the objective is specific, and the posture afterward is not consistent with a mass campaign. Path 3. A major ground entry begins its final steps. This is the least likely on a true 24-hour sprint, but it's the scenario people fear most. If it were happening, you'd see those 3 signals stacking hard: visible logistics posture, clear political narrative alignment, and an operational necessity that other tools can't solve. And you would see coordination behavior change, alliances, basing permissions, host nation statements, mobilization signals, not random spikes of online panic. Now, I want to give you the mistake people make in moments like this, and I'm going to reveal it early so you don't wait for it. The mistake is confusing speculation with confirmation. People see 10 accounts repeating the same claim, and they assume it's true. That's not verification, that's echo. Popularity is not proof. And in conflict, the information layer moves faster than the operational layer, which means you can be emotionally early and factually wrong at the same time. So here's the discipline that makes you hard to manipulate. Treat every next 24 hours claim like a hypothesis, not a fact, until you see the signals that require physical reality. Because physical reality doesn't care about engagement farming. Now, let's talk about why this 24-hour story is so viral, because understanding the psychology helps you resist it. It's viral because it gives people the illusion of being ahead. If you share a 24 hours prediction and it happens, you feel powerful. If you share it and it doesn't happen, there's no penalty, because the internet has already moved on. So the incentives reward making dramatic short-term predictions, even when the evidence is thin. And once you understand incentives, you start seeing the pattern everywhere. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but could the U.S. enter quickly if it wanted to? Yes, depending on what you mean by enter. The U.S. can move fast with air and naval power. It can move fast with limited special operations. It can move fast with posture adjustments and rapid deployments. But a full-scale, sustained ground campaign is slow to build because it's a machine of machines. It requires not just soldiers, but supply. Not just supply, but permissions. Not just permissions, but coalition dynamics. Not just coalition dynamics, but domestic tolerance. And domestic tolerance is the hidden timer on every long war. This is why you should be suspicious of anyone who talks about war like it's only a military decision. War is a political decision wearing a uniform. Now, here's the most useful way to think about entering, if you want to be precise. There are levels. Level 1, posture and deterrence. Forces move. Presence increases. Message is sent. Level 2, active defense and protection. Assets are deployed to protect bases, ships, partners, or specific zones. Level 3, limited kinetic action. Strikes, raids, short missions. Level 4, sustained offensive operations. Long-duration campaigns with persistent objectives. Level 5, occupation-like presence, governance problems, long timelines. When people say, enter the war, they usually jump straight to level 4 or 5 in their imagination. But most real-world decisions happen by climbing levels, not teleporting. That's why the next 24 hours claim needs to be judged against which level is actually being implied. Now, let me give you one practical checklist you can use tonight, tomorrow, whenever this pops up again. If someone says, the Army enters in 24 hours, ask, what is the objective? What forces would be required? Where would they stage? What permissions would they need? What does success look like? What does exit look like? If the person can't answer those questions and they're still acting certain, you're not listening to analysis. You're listening to performance. Because real planners obsess over those questions. Influencers avoid them. Now, let's talk about the phrase fatal miscalculation, because it often shows up next, and it's the most dangerous idea in this entire conversation. People imagine war begins because someone is irrational, sometimes, but more often, escalation happens because systems collide. Fast decisions, incomplete information, fear of being late, pressure to respond, and the human instinct to avoid looking weak. This is why in high-tempo conflict environments, the highest risk isn't always a deliberate invasion. It's an unintended chain reaction, a strike that hits the wrong thing, a misread signal, a defensive overreaction, a political need to respond quickly. And that's why you should watch for miscalculation signals, not just invasion signals, because miscalculation can pull actors in without a single dramatic announcement. Now, if you're asking, what would make the U.S. more likely to put ground forces in soon? Here are the most common drivers in modern history, stated broadly. A direct threat to U.S. personnel that requires physical protection or extraction. A hostage or recovery scenario that cannot be done by remote means. A collapse of a partner's local security that creates an emergency. A need to secure a specific site or corridor. Or a mission framed as humanitarian protection that shifts into security. Those are the kinds of objectives that create near-term ground pressure. But again, ground pressure isn't automatically full war. The internet loves turning any ground move into invasion. Reality is usually a sequence. Now, I want to make this even simpler because simple is sticky. If you're trying to predict ground entry in a 24-hour window, stop watching opinions and start watching constraints. Constraints are the truth. Constraints are basing and access. Constraints are logistics and sustainment. Constraints are political narrative. Constraints are mission definition. And constraints don't change just because someone wrote a scary title. Now, let's say the next 24 hours pass and the U.S. does not enter the war the way the headline claimed. What happens next? The same accounts will not apologize. They will not correct. They will simply move to the next urgent claim. Because the business model is urgency. So your job, if you want to stay sane, is to stop letting other people rent space in your nervous system for free. Treat urgency as a red flag, not as proof. Now, I want to land this with a clean answer to the title, without pretending I can see the future. Can the U.S. enter the war in the next 24 hours? It depends on what you mean by enter. A major ground campaign is unlikely to appear out of nowhere without visible logistics, political alignment, and an urgent objective that can't be solved otherwise. A limited action, increased posture, or expanded involvement is more plausible, and it can still be serious without being a full-scale ground war. So the smartest posture is not panic. It's conditional thinking. If you see logistics posture plus narrative alignment plus urgent objective, probability rises. If you don't, treat the headline as what it most likely is, a viral frame. Now I want your take. Do you think the biggest risk in the next 24 hours is a deliberate ground escalation or a miscalculation chain reaction that forces faster involvement? And do you think people online are confusing increased involvement with ground war on purpose or out of ignorance? Drop your answer. Educational only. Verify breaking claims through multiple credible sources before treating any next 24 hours headline like a finished story.